As you know from watching my show, a lot of information has been coming out that the government is covering up. The Senate is going to be questioning Dr. Anthony Fauci about emails he lied about. And many of us had our lives upended with these lockdowns. Tonight, I have with me a special guest. She is a lieutenant colonel in the Army. She is also a medical doctor, a physician. Dr. Long, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you, Stephen, for having me.
So before we get started, I know that you need to share a disclaimer before we jump into some of these topics, so please go ahead.
Yeah, so my opinions are my own. They do not reflect that of the United States Army, the DoD, or any entity thereof.
Okay, thank you. So, Colonel, the reason I wanted you to come on is I saw several interviews that you've given that are not making their way over to YouTube. But the information that you shared, I found absolutely just like not life-changing, but it's so important for people to understand, especially if they have long COVID or they feel like, man, something is not right. I want people to know that they're not crazy. Something is not right. And you deal with the cream of the cream within the Army, the pilots and the medical assessments and your knowledge of the databases. So I want to just, I've got some questions that I want to dig in with. Now, I know that you've spoken with Senator Ron Johnson, who's been on my show, but why was President Biden, the Pentagon, and the DoD so determined to force a new vaccine, a new medical technology on members of the armed services, not knowing what the long-term effects would be for the military that protects and defends us and much of the world? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a great point, Stephen. And I think that the real question people have to approach is, in the military, I'm not just a doctor, I'm an Army doctor. So what does that mean? That means that we have to look at things differently. And we have this defensive posture. We protect our food supply, our water supply. We have veterinarians that check our meat supply, take care of our animals, everything we can do to mitigate any kind of risk of an adversary having a negative impact on the health of our force. So when you look at it and you say, how many active duty service members died of COVID? The answer was 23. So somewhere there was a discussion in which people said, well, we have 2.4 million service members, I think it's about 1.4 on active duty. We've had 23 die. Should we risk the health of our entire fighting force with a vaccine in which we have no long-term safety data that will force people's bodies to make the spike protein from a code that we got from China? It sounds logical. No, it doesn't. It is horrible. And what constantly comes to my mind is the Trojan Horse. Who would want to get a drug into the arms and the bodies of every single member of our armed forces, our police officers, our Coast Guardsmen, everybody that provides any kind of line of defense for the American people against adversaries, domestic and foreign? And the veracity at which they rolled out this mandate was frightening to the people on the inside who were awake, because most people don't realize that their first step was, if you are a commander in a command position and you refuse to take the vaccine, you are relieved. Yes.
Oh.
So anybody in any position, medical, legal, operational, that said, whoa, wait, I want more information, I don't feel comfortable with this, you're relieved. Next. And and the JAG Corps silenced from providing legal guidance to service members regarding their legal right to for their religious accommodation request, what commanding officers could and couldn't do against them if they refused. That was immediately shut down. And I shared that, one of the first emails I got regarding the mandate was talking about unit personnel will use only as much force as necessary to assist medical personnel with involuntary immunizations. Now, just forget the legality of it. Let's just talk military. What are the implications of ordering white soldiers to hold down a black soldier, assault him, basically, him or her, and inject them with an experimental drug? That kind of brings up, the Tuskegee experiment for me. How about a bunch of men holding down a woman, penetrating her with a syringe and injecting her with something? That's medical rape. And then let's just talk about the rank differential between, is a sergeant going to hold down a lieutenant colonel, and what the implications are for unit morale. We have to trust each other with our lives. And all of a sudden you're telling half, the plan would be to tell half of the people to hold down the other half and violate them in the most intimate of ways, basically forcing their body to produce this spike protein. And the long-term implications don't just stop at them. There's long-term implications for their reproductive health and all of that. And you had to stop and ask, who would possibly sign off on this? I mean, I'm here to tell you, even if we lost 1,000 people to COVID, does vaccinating 2.4 million people with an experimental drug we have no long-term or short-term safety data on, does that get me back the 1,000? No. All I'm doing is risking the health of everyone. And as soon as it became apparent very, very early on that the vaccine didn't stop transmission or infection, but yet they push forward, everyone's going to get vaccinated. And I remember there was a lot of talk, like they can't possibly kick out thousands of us for refusing the vaccine. That would just be ludicrous. And most people don't realize they kicked out more service members from the vaccine mandate than we had die in a 20-year war in Afghanistan and Iraq. So from a strategic perspective, if I take 8,000 people out of our ranks and kick them out, that's the same as losing 8,000 people on the battlefield and they're not there to fight. They're not there to fight, period. Whether they're dead or kicked out from the mandate, they're not there. And so our military caused greater damage to military readiness than the war in Afghanistan and Iraq from that perspective. So yes, you are absolutely right to ask the logical question, why? Why would anyone in their right mind gamble the health, the security of our entire nation with an experimental drug? And there is no sound answer. There is no scenario I can conceive in my mind. If it were that dire, if we were that desperate, then they would have emailed out every doctor and all the people, the best and brightest minds in science, and say, what drugs can we repurpose? How can we tackle this? We need to think outside the box. This is a Los Alamos moment, right? If it is that grave, then we should have been using hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, Lord, we should not have been taping 6 foot safe on the ground and teaching soldiers how to make a mask out of an old t-shirt. That was so embarrassing that this is our strategy for success in the pandemic. Looking like a bunch of fools, 6 foot safe, wearing a mask, has no science behind it, listening to Anthony Fauci, who, by the way, is not a member of the military. And all of a sudden he gets inserted into the chain of command. And we had our experts at Fort Detrick in biological and chemical warfare. We had our own infectious disease experts. Why weren't we listening to them? Why weren't we hearing from them? Why all of a sudden was it, there is one way, and that is whatever the CDC and Anthony Fauci say. And like I said, when you walk in and the first thing you do is relieve anybody with critical thinking skills, like just strategic, you had the medical side of it, you had the strategic side of it, you had the legal side of it. Is it lawful? Is it ethical? Is it moral? It failed all 3 tests. But the damage to our military is so profound. We are facing the worst recruiting and retention crisis in over 50 years. Why? Because service members realized that it didn't matter if they had deployed 5 times, missed out on the birth of all their children, sacrificed everything for this country, that their government would turn on them in a moment's notice, threaten their career, threaten their livelihood, and kick them up to the curb if they didn't bend the knee, if they didn't forfeit their religious freedom, most people don't understand this whole idea, oh, you're in the military, you're their property, they can do whatever they want. They gave you an order. That's an ignorant, oh, I watched Full Metal Jacket mentality. Okay, that's not how it works. Service members we are not slaves. We are not indentured slaves. We do not forfeit our rights. We have the right to religious freedom. And more specifically, this issue had already gone through the courts in the anthrax case, in which they concluded that only the President of the United States could waive service members' right to informed consent for an experimental vaccine. And the President of the United States has never issued that waiver, right? So then they say the drug's FDA approved, but Pfizer says, yes, it's approved, but we're not going to produce any FDA approved vials. Now the Secretary of Defense comes forward and orders all service members to go get vaccinated with FDA approved vaccine. None exists. So you're ordering me to do something that is impossible to do. And when soldiers start saying there is no vials labeled Comirnaty, they come out with this, they're interchangeable. Oh, you got to take them because it's the same.
Yeah.
But under federal code, the label affixes to the product. You can't just take a marker and put a line through it on a vial and write something else. And the big so what is, if you get vaccinated with an EUA product, you have no legal recourse. If our soldiers had been vaccinated with an FDA approved Comirnaty with a lot number that went back to Comirnaty, all of these service members I'm taking care of that are injured could have sued the pharmaceutical companies. So why did the military do that? Because all it did was serve to protect the pharmaceutical companies' liability. Because we're the DOD. We could have demanded, no, you're going to give us the FDA approved vials. In fact, it's a matter of national security. We're forcing these people to get it. And the only way we can force them to get it is if it's FDA approved. Because if it's EUA, the president has to grant a waiver, and he hasn't done that, and he won't do that.
Colonel, can I try to clarify? Just, I want to make sure I understand so that my audience understands, because I read about this, but I want to make sure I understand it. So they had the emergency authorization use formula, for lack of a better word, and then they had the FDA approved formula, and they used marketing to make us believe they were the same when in fact they were two different things. And this one was never allowed to be used. The FDA one was never allowed to be used. It was always the emergency use authorization.
So it doesn't matter. Let's say we put saline in 2 vials, special saline, and one has an EUA label on it and fulfills all of the regulatory requirement for an for labeling of an EUA product. It has lot numbers that tell us it's an EUA. So if like I had a soldier who had myocarditis, it destroyed his heart, destroyed his career. And he said to me, I'm going to sue that, you know, I got the FDA approved. And I said, son, your lot number goes back to an EUA. I don't care what they wrote on your vaccine card or what they entered into your medical record. Pfizer never produced any of the FDA approved vials. You have no legal recourse. I am so sorry. Right? And that's what people have to understand is they could be exactly the same ingredients in 2 different vials. And most people don't understand, why did they rush to put it on the childhood vaccination schedule when children weren't getting COVID? Why? They said, we have the EUA, then when it's FDA approved, we're not going to produce any FDA approved vials. And then we're going to quickly get it on the childhood schedule. Once you get a vaccine on the childhood schedule, it has the complete and total indemnity from lawsuits. So then we're going to wait another year before we produce a vial. It's on the childhood schedule. Ha ha, now you can't sue us. And so imagine when I testified before Senator Johnson and Maddie DeGray was in there, and here she's 12, 13-year-old girl who was in the clinical trials is now in a wheelchair. No legal recourse. You can't even get an apology. I mean, that is what was happening. And soldiers who were digging into this, who were doing their research, realized quickly, this is a bait and switch. And, you know, I desperately tried to tell commanders. They issued a FRAGO order, which is a fragmentary order, which said it was the unit commanders who were responsible to ensure enough FDA approved vaccine was available for their soldiers. And most commanders don't know anything about labeling of vaccines. The order didn't say military doctors will ensure there's enough FDA approved, or the military treatment facility pharmacist will ensure there's enough FDA approved, or the military treatment commander. They said commanders. What does an artillery commander know about the labeling of a vaccine? Nothing.
Yeah, nothing.
And people bought into this. It's the same ingredients. So what? And the so what came when people got injured. And that's when they were, you know, only way you could order soldiers to take it is if it was either FDA approved or it was EUA and the president granted a waiver. So I encourage your viewers out there to go track down the waiver issued by the President of the United States, waiving service members' rights to informed consent for an EUA product. They can't find it. They won't.
Wow, wow, wow. Okay, and so you going to Senator Ron Johnson, would that make you a whistleblower, or you're just coming? Okay, so you go forward, you whistleblow. How did you get that information? You mentioned to me about access to a database.
So initially, you know, I'm an aerospace and occupational medicine doctor with specialty training in the biological and chemical management of chemical and biological casualties. And so this started setting off all the alarm bells for a bioweapon. And not only that, but knowing SARS-CoV-1, the things that we found could be used to treat SARS-CoV-1. And we're not even talking about that. We're not even trying that. So those raised some big alarms, but also seeing, I've been in the military since 1991, seeing this totalitarian, like unbelievable display of power to remove people who at all questioned whether this was a lawful order, whether this was ethical, moral, legal, really set off alarm bells. And then I started seeing soldiers having really bad reactions. And I want to point this out to your viewers. If I give you penicillin and you take it the first day and you have a horrific reaction and you tell me like, oh my gosh, I was laid up in bed, I had a fever, I thought I was going to die. And the next time we give it to you, you have no reaction. And then the third time we give it to you, you have like, you feel like you're going to die again. That's not how medicine works. If you're allergic to a drug, giving you it the next time is going to be worse. So you started to see, why are people having shot to shot variation in their reactions? I tell people a military physician sees some of the most vaccinated individuals in this country. Since the beginning of my career, when I was a medic, I vaccinated thousands upon thousands of people. And as a doctor, I've taken care of people who've been vaccinated with everything from anthrax to smallpox to Japanese encephalitis, you name it. Never in my entire career had I seen people have like this complete litany of reactions to the vaccine, and they weren't small. They weren't like a sore arm. There were people telling you, I felt like I was going to die, or, fever in bed, out of work for numerous days. This starts going, man, there's something not right here. And is the juice worth the squeeze? Our service members are young, healthy people. Their risk of getting COVID was 0.001%. Their risk of dying from COVID, 23 and 2.4 million. So those are the, as a physician, when you give someone informed consent, our data was so granular that I could have had a 25-year-old come into my office and ask me about the vaccine. And I could have said, well, we haven't had a single 25-year-old die of COVID, right? But, or you could take this vaccine that, by the way, isn't a treatment. It's supposed to be preventative. And the side effects are completely unknown. Good luck. Right? What would you take? We could have been telling soldiers to take vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, quercetin, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine. Your viewers can go to early C19 and see the beautiful statistical analysis of all the different things that were tested and repurposed drugs to treat COVID. And that was the other thing that really set off alarm bells, was the suppression of early treatment. Never as doctors would I ever say to a female, oh, you have urinary urgency and frequency. I think you have a bladder infection. Why don't you go home, stay at home, and when you're peeing blood and you're febrile and you feel like you're going to die, come back and I'll think about giving you some antibiotics. That's what COVID was. And I promise you that if tomorrow we said to providers across the country, if a female comes in with symptoms of a urinary tract infection, you can't treat them. Send them home. tell them to only come back when there's gross blood in their urine and they're febrile. We would, the mortality rate from UTIs would go through the roof. Never in medicine do we say, in an infection, do we say it'll get better with no treatment. And we're not even going to try. You have viral infections. Yeah, we'll be like, oh, but here we were seeing that there were things that worked. And instead of the DOD, out of all people, should have been like, yeah, let's look at that. I mean, I even suggested on my small base, which is very small base, hey, why don't we offer everyone hydroxychloroquine, worked for SARS-CoV-1, and while we're waiting for this vaccine to come out, we'll gather enough data to know whether or not hydroxychloroquine works, but it's not going to hurt them. Nobody's prescribed more hydroxychloroquine than the United States military. I mean, we prescribed it to everyone going overseas for malaria prophylaxis, and it was safe then. And then all of a sudden the narrative becomes, oh, it's dangerous. Really? Since when? Since when?
Who would have determined it was dangerous? Because I remember it was like, it was one of those, it was almost worse than a curse word on YouTube. You couldn't say that word or you lost your entire channel. And yet I'm reading all of these international stories of success. Who would have made that decision? Fauci?
That's a really good question. And I think the people don't understand the why is that the EUA explicitly states that if there is an alternative treatment that is already approved, you can't issue an EUA, i.e. the $97 million a day profit in vaccines disappears. If we start telling people to take hydroxychloroquine, and I was told, I said, hey, if you want me to decrease the number of cases of COVID on post, let me tell them about oral rinses. Let me tell them about vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine. And the answer was, if we were to start giving people ivermectin, they won't want to get vaccinated. I don't care. If your goal, and that's in the military, the endpoint, you start with the endpoint in mind. Is the endpoint to stop COVID infections and decrease the number of COVID infections? Or is the endpoint just to get everyone vaccinated so that pharmaceutical companies can make money? If I can stop it with ivermectin and vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, who cares? Those are things that are tried and true. I've never seen anyone given any of those and end up with a stroke, heart attack, MS, blood clot to the spleen and liver, the things I've seen in young, healthy people. And so when you ask what led to me going to Senator Johnson, it was all of those things. It was every red flag being thrown, and you take the accumulation of everything you've learned in the military to be vigilant, to not just, I'm not a civilian doctor who just has patients come and go. These are my soldiers. I am responsible for them. I have to look at them every day. I have to account for their health. And those are our war fighters. And we would not let someone just come on our post and say, hey, can you line up all 4,000 people and let me just inject them with a miscellaneous substance? Oh my goodness. Do you know what would happen if someone tried to do that? We'd be calling the FBI, and they'd be, we'd be looking hard at, like, what's their mode? What are they trying to do here? Yeah. And instead we just said, Moderna's never produced, what did they produce? And very early on, I had a friend whose son has Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. And I think it was very it's very much providence that I had him as a friend. His son had years and years ago received a RNA for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. He was part of a clinical trial. And the father told me, like, I'm a little confused. Every excretion that came out of his body after he got the RNA had to be burned. Like any secretions that came out of him, all the linen, anything that touched his skin had to be incinerated. You know, he had significant heart issues. And so the dad was telling me early on, like, I don't think they've perfected this yet.
Yeah.
And why aren't they talking about all the excretions and the shedding of people that are going to get this vaccine? That wasn't even talked about, but during that clinical trial, it was very much on the forefront of the clinical investigators' concerns. So,
wow, I just keep I keep thinking, why, like you said, that you wouldn't line up 4,000 people and give them a miscellaneous thing. Why would they risk the entire military? The military does so much for the country.
well, I'll tell you, when this came out, there was an email that said, okay, we're going to do a clinical safety trial for 30 months on these selected locations, these military bases. And I quickly scanned the email. I was like, oh, thank God we're not on the list, right? And I'm thinking, as someone who's done research, you can't turn research out of any significance in a month, 2 months. So I'm like, 30 months. I have 30 months until I'm going to be forced to take this vaccine. Thank God someone's going about this slow and methodical. They're going to take a small group of soldiers. They're going to test it. And it was like not even a week later that we have an announcement, Moderna's here, everyone come get their shots. And I'm thinking, they just started the safety testing.
And Moderna had never brought a product to market before that, right?
No. So you're sitting here going, and people were like happy to get it at that time. And I was sitting there going, guys, like, lessons learned from drugs like thalidomide, DES. I mean, Google the list of drug recalls. The pharmaceutical companies, it takes on average 5 to 10 years for the pharmaceutical companies, for us in medicine to gather enough data to point back and say, hey, this drug is causing Vioxx, it's causing, you know, heart attacks or whatever. So here they are telling pregnant women it's safe, when the clinical trial didn't even go long enough for a woman to get vaccinated, get pregnant, have a baby. It wasn't even long enough for that heading into it. And they're out there negligently telling women it's safe in pregnancy. Funny, they can't even eat hot dogs, white cheese, you know, and take little outside of a Tylenol. So when it was no one thing, it was looking at the violation of every single thing we have in place to protect our soldiers, to protect people from pharmaceutical drugs. And the whole testing process is all put in place from very painful lessons learned over the years. I mean, thalidomide babies born without appendages.
I've seen the flipper pictures. I've tried showing that to other people, and they're like, why would you show me that? I'm like, so that you question things. Like you have to question things. Sadly, oh, go ahead.
I think that and too, in the military, I think I'm extra sensitive to that, because I raised my right hand and I took an oath and I signed on the line. When I got pregnant with my daughter, I now had a genetically distinct human being in my body who did not take an oath, who the government did not have a right to do anything that would impact her body, i.e. through my body. And so historically through the military doctors are acutely sensitive. We can't, we have to take into those considerations. We don't send pregnant women out to the range to go shoot lead bullets. We don't do these things because it could have an impact on their baby. And a lot of people don't appreciate birth defects are going to happen. They're going to happen before the pandemic. But what if you're a woman who takes a drug and your baby ends up with a birth defect and you have to spend the rest of your life thinking, is it because I took that drug? Yeah, that's the second and third order effects that parents will forever have to live with. Are we unable to conceive children? And we're going to go childless for the rest of our marriage because we took this vaccine. These are lifelong implications that far outlive your service to the military.
Yeah.
And that is the casualness at which that was approached. Let me tell you something. If you want to break faith with a service member, hurt their child. You want to break faith with a service member, do something that compromises their fertility and their ability to have children. Because service members understand when they come in that they may lose an arm, a leg, they may lose their life. They agree to that and they go into that. It's their informed consent coming into the military. That's part of what may happen. Nobody comes into the military thinking, I'm going to be Pfizer Pharmaceuticals lab rat. No parent sends their child into the military and thinks, well, my kid may have to come back and move in with me after they have some devastation from taking an experimental drug. I've talked to those parents. I've talked to those soldiers who've had to move back in with mom and dad. People that made a million good decisions in their life, responsible decisions, went to West Point, was a collegiate athlete, did everything right. And then they didn't do drugs, they didn't drink and drive, but they followed an order to let themselves be injected with an experimental drug. And now they're moving back in with mom and dad because they can't take care of themselves. They have some kind of medical condition that has now stripped them of their career, their health, their independence. Soldiers with Guillain-Barré, the litany goes on. I've seen soldiers with strokes, blood clots, cancers, thyroid dysfunction. I had 2 soldiers that went blind that contacted me. One lost all his peripheral vision, one went blind in one eye. I had a pilot who had developed a massive clot in his brain. And the litany of things I have never seen in my entire career. All of a sudden, you're seeing all of these rare things in short order, 1 to 2 years. And I think the really concerning thing for me is still seeing people having strokes 3 years after they're vaccinated, still seeing people developing all kinds of weird autoimmune disorders.
Yeah.
So
just so people understand, you oversee the pilots. These are the healthiest, most medically what's the word, observed people probably in America. So it's not like you were looking at the general population or the population of Birmingham, Alabama, or New York City. Like, you're looking at the healthiest young men and women that can be pilots, and you start seeing all of this come up.
Right. And when you're a brigade surgeon, a battalion surgeon in the military, you're not actually a surgeon most of the time. You're a doctor who is responsible for that brigade or that battalion. And so you do, your job is to ensure the health of that population. So I may not see in clinic 4,000 people, but I will review their charts, and anyone who's unable to fly or go serve, go to duty, I have to explain to the commander once a month, like, is this person ever going to get back to flying? Oh, they're waiting for their cardiology appointment. They have brain fog, probably don't want them in a helicopter, so I do the review of the charts, and you look and you see, and that is in this population more so than any other population out there. It just hits you in the face. Now, if you're a general practitioner on the civilian side, people come to you when they want to come to you, right? There is no monthly review of everybody in your empanelment. You maybe find out randomly, oh yeah, that kid died or was hospitalized. But the average civilian doctor out there would not have this kind of view. And so when you look and you say, these are some of the youngest, healthiest people, they're primarily males. And I've never seen anything like this. And people that, all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, strokes happen all the time. Really? I've never seen a stroke in a 23-year-old, a 24-year-old, and a 27-year-old before the vaccine mandate. And all of a sudden it's no big deal. Sudden cardiac death, at the controls of a helicopter. Like, these are things that are very concerning. And that was the other side as a flight surgeon and aerospace medicine doctor, our whole bread and butter is to make sure pilots are safe to fly high performance aircraft that carry armament and fight and win our wars. And so they can't, a pilot can't take Benadryl and go fly. Most of the over-the-counter medications you see at Walgreens or CVS, a pilot couldn't take and go fly. And our own aeromedical policy said that pilots could not take anything that was not FDA approved for 3, preferably 5 years. The FAA's policy said pilots cannot take anything that hasn't been approved by the FDA for a year. So every single pilot flying a commercial airline that was vaccinated violated that, because there was no FDA approved drug out there. And it sure hadn't been approved for a year before everyone got it. Same thing in the military. And I just tell people, some decisions you can take back. This was not one of them. And why any rational person would charge forward in a one-way direction with our entire military was in sheer insanity to me. It wasn't even like, yeah, we'll take 1,000 people and see how things go with them, and then we'll cautiously, or we'll just offer it to the people most at risk. No, we just said everyone, and if you won't take it, you're out. And willing to kick out hundreds of thousands if needed be. Does it make any sense?
Not to me. Not to me, it doesn't.
I mean, even if it stopped transmission and infection, and it was a perfect vaccine, and it had no side effects, would it still be worth it to kick out 8,000 highly qualified, highly trained human assets in the military? And I'm not talking the guy that went, through short training. We're talking Navy nuclear subcommanders. We're talking people that it takes 15 years, 12 years for them to learn their craft. And we kicked them out. We didn't try to accommodate them. We kicked them out. And believe me, they're not coming back.
Yeah, I read the lawsuits that they're attempting now, and the military saying, hey, you guys can come back now. We've lifted the mandates. It's like, it's too little too late.
Not when you know as someone who served for a long time, the nice thing about the military was always you weren't going to show up to work and get a red letter like you've been laid off today, right? There's a due process, and there wasn't ever layoffs in the military. So this thing really was a complete novelty for people to be told, like, if you don't get this, you're going to be out, and you're going to be out in short order. So all of a sudden, service members are like, hey, but look, I deployed all these times and I have all these ribbons and I have a pristine record. And they're like, we don't care. Nobody. I mean, I was the only doctor in my brigade, and I filed a religious accommodation request. And I remember talking to the command and saying, you're denying my request. So you would rather have no doctor for the entire brigade than an unvaccinated Christian? And the answer was, that is correct. I mean, and then after they stop the mandate, you got to go back and work with people who were completely willing to throw away your 15, 20, 30-year career in the trash like it was nothing because you didn't bend the knee. And then you got to go back and pretend it was like being in an abusive relationship and getting pounded on for three years. And then all of a sudden one day someone's like, hey, you gonna cook dinner? You know, like, aren't we good? And you're like, well, I still have, you know, a black eye and a broken arm. And yeah, I kind of got to feel some kind of way about what happened the last 3 years. And that's why, you know, 231 of us signed the Declaration of Military Accountability, because people like myself, we served in the military. We love the military. We're very proud of our service, but we recognize fully that the questions you're asking are important questions, and they have to be answered. And no one in the Senate, no one in the Congress was pounding their fist demanding the answers to those very important questions before one-way decisions were made. And service members were really kind of sitting back, desperate for the American people to stand up for us. While all of this was going on, we were desperate for this groundswell of civilians to just be calling their senators and congressmen and raising hell. Like, what are you doing? But the problem was the civilians were enmeshed in their own mandates and struggling for their own jobs. But it's not a good feeling to be in the military and know that, you know, unlawful orders are being given, people are being harmed, and you're not getting any relief. And the government knows they can wait you out in the courts, right? The anthrax court case took like, what, 20 years to get an answer. So they know that what they want will already be achieved before you get any relief. And so that's what's gone on. And it's been tremendously devastating, but we want, and people have to be held accountable. People who failed to ask the question that you just asked at the beginning and have those answers in hand. Worst case scenario, what could possibly happen if we give this experimental drug to the entire fighting force? Worst case scenario, let's just say it causes strokes and clots in 5% of the force. Let's say it's just 5% or 1%. A reasonable person would have asked that. Let's just say lowball it. Let's just say 1%. Can we afford to lose 1%? That's a lot.
It is. Yeah. At 2 million, that's a lot of people.
And that, you know, that's why we get paid the big money, is to think about those things in a different manner than civilians. And like, okay, why is that person trying to come on base and inject us, or who's putting stuff in the water supply? And you look at soldiers and you look for trends, just like when we're overseas. they're looking at trends to see like, hey, were the food trucks that were bringing food in off the economy onto the base, or if all of a sudden a whole bunch of soldiers get sick, your spidey senses go up real quick. Like, is this just an accidental food poisoning, or is someone intentionally contaminating our food?
Yeah.
So, but I hope, and I think our military needs to be restored through accountability. And when people are held accountable for their decisions that gravely harm the morale, the safety, and the health and the trust of our soldiers, then retention will return. People will stay. But when you violate that level of trust with people who are trusting you with their lives, that trust will not be quickly or easily reestablished. But it will never happen if people aren't held accountable. I mean, same thing with Anthony Fauci. Maybe someone would be asking like, well, what's his security clearance? Does he have any financial conflicts of interest that could undermine national security?
We still don't know. He refuses to answer. We know he's getting kickbacks. Rand Paul was able to run that down. The head of Pfizer is a veterinarian. He went to veterinarian school. Like he's not, you know, it's like you said, how come our infectious disease physicians in the military aren't taking the lead on this? Like I have so many more questions, but you know, I want to be respectful.
I went to the Global Medicine Symposium at Wright-Patt Air Force Base right before President Trump locked down the country. And in that, you know, we had the Air Force, Army, and Navy infectious disease experts giving us this long course for doctors who were deploying and going to see global health issues. And everyone was asking, well, what about COVID? Well, what about COVID? And all the infectious disease experts in the military were like, we're not even going to waste our time on that. You know, it's going to be like a bad flu.
Wow.
Like that's what we heard during that entire course. Not even gonna waste time talking about it. It's going to be a bad flu. It's a lot of hype. And I left that course feeling like I don't have to worry about COVID. I knew these people, I trusted them, I respected them, and they were not you know, they were not talking about 6 feet safe and masks and you know, that kind of foolishness. And I think back to that, and you know, and I look up and I see President Trump ordering the retooling of Ford Motor Plant and all these things that were completely incongruent with what we heard at the Global Medicine Symposium. And I thought, either he knows something we don't know, and this is a bioweapon, or people are not getting the same information. And I will look back at that and I think, would it have been different if President Trump would have said at the very beginning, this is a biological weapon until proven otherwise. Hey, China, we are going to assume that we have been attacked by you until you give us full access to the Wuhan lab and let us do this full investigation. And oh, by the way, the military is going to be in charge of this response. You know, so part of me questions if our entire economy and country would not have had a very different outcome if President Trump would have taken that move.
Yeah. I've wondered the same thing. I've wondered a lot of things. I'm so grateful that you came on. I think I actually left this conversation with more questions, but because you brought up things that I didn't know about, that I'm like, oh my gosh, now I want to know the answer to that and this and that. So, but I appreciate you coming on, everything that you've done, being a whistleblower, looking into the database and seeing, wait a minute, something is not right. They are taking big risks and stepping forward. I really
And still
appreciate
to
that.
this day, the database shows 151% increase in myocarditis, 43% increase in pulmonary embolisms. I think it's like 37% increase in esophageal cancer, ovarian dysfunction, neurologic dysfunction, hypertension. I mean, it's there. And why people aren't asking what's in VAERS? What's the military seeing? What, and none of this data is really being published. And we were told that we could trust the rollout of these vaccines because they were going to have the most technologically advanced surveillance system and the V-Safe and all this stuff. And then we have to go to court and force them to give that data. So, but I greatly appreciate people like you asking the tough questions. And I have to say this, I greatly appreciate Elon Musk opening up some form of free speech, Clout Hub, another platform I know I won't be censored on. And how differently this whole thing could have gone about if companies like Facebook and Twitter at that time hadn't censored all the people trying to raise the warning bells. And I encounter so many people who tell me, oh my gosh, if I would have heard your speech or your testimony, I would have never gotten a vaccine. I think as a doctor, probably one of the most painful things I hear on a daily basis is I didn't want to get it, but I wanted to provide for my family. And as a doctor, all medical professionals should just be mortified at the thought of any patient regretting being bullied, threatened, coerced, manipulated into getting a medical treatment or procedure that they did not want to get. This is such a disgrace in medicine.
Okay, let's end it there. Thank you again. Thank you for your service to our country. Thank you for taking care of the men and women that, you know, bravely risk their lives to keep the homeland safe and peace around the planet. I'm just very grateful. I'm grateful for your courage and coming forward. I asked Senator Johnson, how come nobody, now that it's over, wants to get to the bottom of this? And he said, I don't know, but it's very suspicious. You know, so the fact that they don't want to do a moratorium and look back on it is also very suspicious. But Colonel Long, thank you so much for taking time out of your night. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thank you very much.